The transmission crackled with a cryptic phrase. At first it seemed like just another coded message, but a quiet codebreaker saw something others didn't. A hidden betrayal buried deep inside Allied command. Who was the Phantom, and could he be stopped in time? In the dimly lit war room of Bletchley Park, the air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. Typewriters clicked endlessly, papers rustled under anxious hands, and walls were covered in maps and coded messages no ordinary man could understand. Among the dozens of quiet minds working behind the scenes of World War II, one stood out, not for his rank, but for his sharp eyes and sharper instincts. Staff Sergeant Lowell Abrams. At just 26, Lowell didn't look like a soldier. He wasn't the kind to carry a weapon or storm a beach. Instead, his battlefield was language. Born and raised in Rockport, Maine, Lowell had always had a fascination with words. By the time he was in high school, he spoke German and Italian fluently, skills that eventually caught the attention of Army recruiters searching for more than just strength and speed. He was assigned to the Signal Intelligence Service, SIS, a quiet, almost invisible unit that most soldiers never even heard about. Their job wasn't glamorous. They didn't wear medals or give speeches. They listened, watched, decoded, and passed along information that could change the course of battles without firing a single shot. For Lowell, it was exactly the kind of war he was meant to fight. By early 1944, the pressure in every Allied command center was rising. Operation Overlord, the long-planned invasion of Nazi-occupied France, was just months away. Every detail mattered. Every scrap of intelligence, a single intercepted word, a strange phrase, or even a pause in radio transmission, could make the difference between victory and disaster. Lowell was posted at Bletchley Park, the heart of code-breaking operations in Britain. Though technically a British base, it had quietly become a joint operation between US and UK intelligence services. Here, linguists, mathematicians, and cryptographers worked around the clock, sorting through endless access transmissions that flooded the airwaves. Lowell spent his days hunched over radio transcripts, scanning enemy broadcasts for any inconsistencies or patterns. Most days it felt like searching for a whisper in a storm. But on one quiet evening, as a steady rain tapped against the windows, he came across something unusual. It was a shortwave transmission, picked up near the Dutch border. The language wasn't unusual, standard coded German, but a particular phrase caught his attention. The Phantom confirms delivery before the Eagle moves. The message was vague, and the cipher wasn't especially complex, but the tone felt different, off. He reread it a dozen times. The Phantom confirms delivery. What delivery and who or what was the Phantom? Lowell flagged the message and brought it to the attention of Lieutenant Whitmore, his direct superior. Whitmore was a man with sharp suits and little patience for mystery. It's vague, Whitmore said, barely glancing at the sheet. Could be code for food rations, or fuel. Phantom might be a call sign. Lowell pressed gently. But what if it's not? What if the Phantom isn't a call sign but a person, or worse, someone working on our side? Whitmore sighed. Look, Abrams, the Nazis are masters at throwing out fake signals. That's half their game. We can't chase every shadow they toss into the wind. But Lowell couldn't shake the feeling. He spent that night going back through previous weeks of transcripts, searching for any other references. He found 3. Each was subtle, almost hidden, but always linked to troop movement, supply lines, or Allied planning. In each one, the term Red Phantom appeared, sometimes as a silent figure, sometimes linked to timing, but never directly described, and always followed by disruptions in Allied communications. Lowell put together a short report. He detailed the patterns, the timing, and his theory that the Red Phantom wasn't just a code, it was a person, a double agent, perhaps already placed somewhere high in Allied ranks. He didn't claim to know who. They didn't speculate beyond what the messages implied. He handed the report to Whitmore and waited. Days passed. No one said a word. Finally, Whitmore returned the report with a single note scribbled across the cover in pencil. Too speculative. Stay focused. Lowell was frustrated but not surprised. He knew analysts were expected to translate and report, not interpret or imagine. Still, something in his gut wouldn't let it go. He tucked a copy of the intercepted messages into his personal file just in case. From that point forward, every message he reviewed seemed like a piece of a puzzle no one else wanted to see. And deep inside, he began to wonder, was someone inside their own network feeding secrets to the other side? Could the Red Phantom be real? If so, who was listening to their conversations? Who was watching their movements? And most of all, how deep did the Phantom's reach go? What Lowell didn't know was that his quiet observation had set something in motion, something that would pull him far away from his desk and deep into enemy territory. Not as a linguist, not as a codebreaker, but as something he never expected to become: a spy. Weeks passed in Bletchley Park and the tension around Lowell Abrams hadn't eased, though he returned to his daily translations and decoding tasks. The message about the Red Phantom lingered in his thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't leave. He kept a quiet watch, scanning transmissions for any pattern, any thread he could pull that might unravel more of the mystery. Most of what came through was routine chatter, unit placements, weather conditions, coded supply requests. But then, just after midnight on May 16, 1944, a transmission came across his desk that stopped him cold. It was fragmented, the signal was weak, parts of it lost in static, but what remained was enough to raise the alarm in his mind. Coordinates were listed, though no clear location was named. A set of strange numbers and letters followed, not typical call signs or phrases. Then, near the end, a few words jumped out. Eagle arrives with storm, followed by a partial list of what looked like code names. He stared at the paper. His hands trembled slightly. Storm was a word that had appeared before, in reference to Overlord, the code name for the Normandy landings, and Eagle, that was often used in enemy traffic to describe Allied forces. But what struck him most was the list of names. They weren't real names, but code names used internally by Allied command staff, information almost no one outside top-level meetings would even know. He circled one, Flint. It was the code name for a senior logistics officer managing supply chains to the invasion beaches. Lowell leaned back in his chair, heart racing. The Phantom was real, and now there was a plan. Sabotage, delivered from inside Allied operations. The coordinates might point to targeted ambush zones, and the presence of officer code names suggested something deeper, possibly fake orders, rerouting vital equipment, or misguiding troops during the most important military operation of the war. If the wrong supplies went to the wrong beaches, or if Allied forces followed misdirected commands, the entire landing could descend into chaos. Lowell stood up and took the transcript straight to Lieutenant Whitmore. Again, this time he didn't wait for permission. "This is it," he said firmly. "This is the Phantom's plan. They're aiming to sabotage logistics just as the invasion starts. These names are real, sir, and these codes, someone on the inside is giving them out." Whitmore looked over the pages, slower this time. His expression darkened as he read. Lowell could see doubt turn to concern, then worry. "We'll escalate this," Whitmore finally said. "We'll send it straight to Washington and Schaeff." But there was something in his voice, hesitation, a pause, like he wasn't sure who he could trust to carry the message forward. That evening, Lowell returned to his bunk, but couldn't sleep. Memories stirred. His brother Aaron, who had enlisted straight out of school, full of dreams and jokes. He'd written letters every other week, signing them with "See you after the war." Aaron had been stationed at Pearl Harbor in 1941. The news of the attack had come on a winter morning, quiet, simple, and unbearable. Lowell had never seen his father cry until that day, and it was that moment, not the grief but the silence that followed, that pushed Lowell to join the war effort. Not with a gun, but with his mind. He couldn't stop what happened to Aaron, but maybe he could stop what was coming next. The next morning he returned early to the war room. He wanted to follow up, make sure the message was being relayed to the right people, but when he approached his console, a red warning light blinked on his encryption machine, something he'd never seen before. Confused, he tried the key sequence to reset the terminal, but it remained frozen. All outgoing communication lines were down. Around the room, others were experiencing the same. Technicians were called in. Frustrated voices rose in every corner. Lowell didn't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. "System error," someone muttered behind him. "No way this happens without help." Lowell looked at the crippled machines, then at the transcript still in his jacket pocket. He felt the weight of it. That single document could decide the fate of tens of thousands of soldiers preparing to cross the English Channel. And now, at the exact moment the message needed to go out, the system collapsed. He stepped out of the room, into the corridor. His mind raced. Washington wouldn't see the message in time. Allied command might still be blind to the infiltration, and the Phantom, whoever they were, was still out there, quietly bending the entire invasion toward disaster. Then came the decision. one he didn't second guess. He turned back toward the war room, but not to return to his desk. Instead, he walked to the exit, then straight to the operations director's office. He knocked once, opened the door, and looked the startled colonel in the eyes. "I need clearance for transport," Lowell said. "I'm hand-delivering this intel." The colonel looked up from his files. "That's not protocol." "No," Lowell replied, "but I'm not trusting a system that just went dark on the most important message I've seen in this war." There was a long pause. Finally, the colonel reached for a form and handed it to him. "You have 24 hours. If you're not in France by then, don't bother going at all." Lowell nodded. His mission had just changed. He was no longer just a codebreaker. He was now stepping into the shadows, to carry a message, expose a traitor, and stop a betrayal that could shape the outcome of the war. Lowell Abrams had always seen the war from behind a desk, papers, codes, translations. But now, as he stepped onto the damp platform at the small military airfield just outside London, clutching a satchel of classified transcripts and forged documents, the war had become real in a way he never expected. He had prepared to fly to Washington, to deliver the message by hand to the highest levels of Allied command. But the night before his departure, everything changed. His orders were altered, not by accident but by design. A senior officer from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, met him in a candlelit room, deep beneath Bletchley Park, where only a few knew of the breach in Allied intelligence. The man spoke softly, deliberate. "You're not going home," he said. "You're going into Europe, Switzerland." "Switzerland?" Lowell asked, confused. "Why?" "Because we can't be sure who's compromised," the man replied. "We need the intel delivered to our OSS station in Geneva, quietly, no transmissions, no cables, handed off in person." And so, just like that, Lowell Abrams, a quiet linguist from Maine, became Ernst Baumann, a Swiss-German textile trader, with roots in Zurich and a history that didn't really exist. His hair was darkened slightly with dye. He was given a mustache. His American passport was locked away. In its place, a stack of carefully aged Swiss papers and a worn wallet full of francs and ration coupons. Every detail of Ernst Baumann's life had been crafted by OSS handlers, from the names of his business partners to the brand of fabric he was supposedly selling. Before dawn, he boarded a disguised military transport that would drop him in southern France, just over the border, from where he'd have to cross occupied territory on foot, train, and sometimes through back alleys. He wasn't trained for this. He knew that no weapons, no field exercises, no practice runs, just his knowledge of the code, his ability to speak flawless German and passable French, and the quiet understanding that the message he carried could shift the course of the invasion. Every step would be watched. The Gestapo was known to intercept travelers, especially in the countryside. Black market traders and desperate civilians often worked both sides, offering information to whoever paid most, and in villages stripped bare by war, even a man's shoes could mark him as an outsider. As the truck rolled through the hills of Vichy, France, Lowell kept his eyes low and his back straight. His satchel never left his side. Inside it, sewn into the lining, were 2 sheets of carefully folded rice paper, nearly invisible. On them, the intercepted message translated, the Phantom's trail, the compromised code names, the falsified routes. His contact in Geneva was known only by a phrase, "the tailor mends quietly." He was to approach a tailor shop near Lake Geneva, use the phrase, and wait for instructions. But just before he crossed the border, a British liaison officer pulled him aside in a dim cafe posing as a customs post. The man was tall, sharp-eyed, with the calm tone of someone who'd seen too many betrayals. "Whatever you do," he said without looking up from his coffee, "don't hand anything over until you're sure who you're dealing with." Lowell frowned. "What do you mean?" "There's been a leak," the liaison whispered. "Names have been passed. Some of our agents are gone. We don't know how deep it goes, but someone in the Geneva cell is not who they claim to be." Lowell felt the weight in his chest tighten. "Then who do I trust?" The man slid a small card across the table. On it was a name and a number. "If anything feels wrong, you contact this person. She's with us. Deep cover. You'll know her by the blue ribbon on her wrist." With that, the man stood up and disappeared into the cold morning fog. Now Lowell found himself moving through the narrow train corridors, clutching his documents, watching every face, every glance. In the towns he passed, German flags hung limp in the wind. In the station stops, Patrols walked with quiet authority, eyes scanning for signs of nervousness, weakness, or outsiders pretending to belong. He couldn't stop thinking about what the liaison had said. Someone inside the OSS cell in Switzerland was leaking names. That meant the very people who were supposed to protect him might be watching him for the wrong reasons. By the time he reached the Swiss border, neutral but crawling with eyes from both sides, he was exhausted. He handed over his papers, his forged identification, and held his breath. The guard barely looked up, then stamped his card and waved him through. Geneva was quiet, cold, and clean, a sharp contrast to the tension that weighed down Lowell's thoughts. Somewhere in this peaceful city, the Red Phantom's path intersected with his own. But who could he trust? The tailor's shop was only a few streets away. Its windows were dusty, the sign above faded by years of sun and snow. He waited outside a moment before pushing the door open, rehearsing the phrase in his head. As the bell above the door rang, a quiet voice from the back of the shop said, "One moment, please." Lowell glanced down, trying to steady himself. When the tailor emerged, Lowell opened his mouth, but something stopped him. On the tailor's wrist was a plain watch, but no blue ribbon. The warning echoed in his mind. Someone was pretending to be a friend, and if he handed over the message now, the Phantom might win. He smiled politely and said nothing. The game had just begun. The cold wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and smoke as Lowell Abrams, now fully immersed in his false identity as Ernst Bowman, crossed quietly into northern France under the cover of darkness. A team from the French resistance, quiet, organized, and fiercely determined, had met him near the border and smuggled him through a series of safe houses, fields, and forests. His new disguise was as complete as it was risky. A deft textile merchant, mute and slightly hunched, his suitcase filled with folded fabric samples and forged travel permits. It was a role that required constant vigilance. He had to be silent, not just by choice, but in character. Every glance, every movement had to be deliberate. He carried a small notepad and pencil in his coat pocket, using it to communicate with others in the role of a man who hadn't heard a word in years. The resistance fighters briefed him carefully. "Once you're north of Rouen," one whispered, "it's just patrols, checkpoints, and eyes watching from windows. No one can help you pass there. You're on your own." He nodded once, tightening the scarf around his neck as he stepped off the back of the cart carrying firewood. The resistance driver gave a final nod and disappeared into the shadows. Lowell moved slowly down the cobbled street of a war-worn village, his eyes low, his ears sharp. The morning fog hung low over the rooftops, and he kept to the sides of buildings, blending with the rhythm of life that tried desperately to appear normal under German occupation. Then came his first test. At the edge of a narrow stone bridge leading out of the village, a Nazi checkpoint had been set up, 2 uniformed soldiers checking identification, while an officer stood nearby, arms crossed, watching everyone with cold precision. Lowell joined the line of travelers, an old woman with a crate of eggs, a man on a bicycle, and 2 teenagers pushing a wheelbarrow. He clutched his suitcase tightly, his palms damp. When it was his turn, the officer grabbed his papers and studied them for a moment. Then, in a sudden, sharp tone, he barked a question in rapid French. Lowell froze. He couldn't answer. He wasn't supposed to be able to answer. The officer repeated the question, louder this time, stepping closer. Lowell blinked, shrugged, and pointed to his ears, then his throat. He opened his mouth and made no sound. The officer narrowed his eyes. Then, with startling speed, the man snapped his fingers directly in Lowell's face. Lowell flinched. It was a small movement, barely a reaction, but enough to raise suspicion. The officer's lips twisted into a smirk. "Interesting," he said in French. "Perhaps your ears work better than you claim." Panic surged in Lowell's chest. He felt his heartbeat race, his mind scrambling for a way out. Then, without warning, he dropped to one knee, shaking uncontrollably, eyes rolled upward, his body stiffened in a mock seizure, a risky move but one rehearsed in the quiet hours before his journey. A murmur rippled through the small line of people. The officer backed away slightly, uncertain. One of the younger guards shouted something and ran to get water. Another muttered about just letting him go. After 30 seconds, Lowell let his body relax, breathing heavily, pretending to come out of it slowly. He scribbled something in his notepad and handed it to the officer with trembling hands. "Epileptic. Traveling to meet my cousin in Rouen. Please, I am harmless." The officer read the note and hesitated. Then he waved him through with a warning glare. Lowell didn't look back. His legs were still unsteady when he reached the main road leading to ruin. The narrow escape had drained him, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Every hour counted. The message in his satchel, sewn carefully into the seams of his clothing now, had to reach the right hands before the Normandy landings began. As he reached the outskirts of Rouen, Lowell paused briefly near a small cafe, just off the square. He sat at an outdoor table, pretending to sketch fabric patterns in his notebook. Inside, locals nursed small cups of coffee or played cards quietly. An accordion player filled the silence with soft music. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. A man in a brown overcoat stepped out of the cafe, walked a few feet, then stopped. He didn't look directly at Lowell, but seemed to linger a bit too long near a flower cart. When Lowell gathered his things and walked down the street, the man followed at a distance, not close enough to cause alarm, but always within sight. Lowell's breath caught. Was it just a coincidence? A neighbor going the same way? He turned right at the corner. So did the man. He crossed the street. The man did too. Just a minute later, someone was following him. He ducked into a small bookstore, watching through the dusty glass. The man paused outside a tobacco stall, pretending to inspect cigars, but never really buying anything. Lowell's mind raced. Could this be one of the Phantom's watchers, or a Gestapo agent tipped off by the suspicious scene at the checkpoint? He waited a full 5 minutes, pretending to browse a shelf of travel books. Then he slipped out the back door and moved swiftly through an alley, emerging on a side street that ran behind the local cathedral. He didn't stop walking until he reached the address given to him by the liaison in Geneva, the one with the backup contact, the blue ribbon. He knocked once, waited, then twice again. The door opened slowly. A woman stood in the shadows, and on her wrist, just barely visible, was a faded blue ribbon. For the first time in days, Lowell allowed himself a shallow breath of relief. But the relief wouldn't last long, because even as the door closed behind him, the question remained. Who was the man in the brown coat? And how close had he gotten? The door closed quietly behind Lowell as the shadows swallowed him. The room inside was small and dimly lit, but warm, with a single lamp casting a soft glow over a sturdy wooden table. Sitting across from him was Elodie Marchand, a woman whose presence was calm yet charged with an undeniable strength. Elodie was a former school teacher, her sharp eyes holding stories of hardship and loss. Her dark hair was tied back tightly, and though her hands rested calmly on the table, Lowell could see the firmness in her jaw. She spoke in a hushed voice as she explained her role in the French resistance. "My brother was taken," she said quietly. "The Gestapo accused him of hiding Allied flyers. They never brought him back. I carry his courage in my heart now. I will not let his death be in vain." Lowell nodded, feeling the weight of her loss deeply. The war was filled with stories like hers, ordinary people pushed to extraordinary acts by the cruel hand of conflict. Now, here she was, risking everything to stop a threat even greater than what most knew. They wasted no time. Their goal was clear. They needed to reach Lyon, where an OSS contact awaited with vital information and a safe passage out of France. The journey would be long, and the danger immense. Elodie helped Lowell secure his disguise further, a worn scarf to cover his face when necessary, instructions on how to avoid speaking in public, and advice on blending in with the travelers. "The train," she warned, "is watched closely. You must watch every shadow and every face." They boarded the train late that afternoon, finding seats in a crowded coach filled with soldiers, workers, and families trying to keep life moving despite the war. Lowell felt the hum of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of wheels beneath the tracks as a strange comfort. It was a reminder that movement meant progress, that every mile brought him closer to the truth. But tension clung to the air like a heavy fog. Just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the train screeched to an abrupt halt near a small station outside a sleepy village. Outside, Lowell heard voices shouting commands, rough, sharp, German accents cutting through the quiet evening. The German military police had stopped the train. Elodie's eyes narrowed. "This isn't routine," she whispered urgently. "They've been tipped off." Lowell's heart pounded. If the Nazis knew something, it could only mean one thing. Someone close to them was leaking information. As officers boarded, the crowd inside the train grew uneasy. Lowell and Elodie exchanged quick glances. They had prepared for danger, but nothing could prepare them for what came next. The officers moved through the cars, checking papers, questioning travelers with a sharp intensity. Lowell kept his face hidden beneath his scarf, his body tense as a spring ready to snap. Suddenly a sharp cry echoed from the next car. One of the resistance couriers, a young woman named Marie, who had been helping them, was seized. She had memorized a critical part of the code sequence Lowell had uncovered, a secret that could unravel everything. Elodie's face went pale. "Marie," she whispered, gripping Lowell's arm tightly. "She's the key. We have to move now." Before Lowell could respond, chaos erupted. Marie struggled fiercely but was quickly overpowered. The officers dragged her off the train before Lowell's eyes. He felt a cold shock. The loss of someone so vital was a blow beyond words. Without hesitation, Elodie pulled Lowell toward the emergency exit at the rear of the car. The officers were distracted, focused on the passengers, giving them a precious few seconds. They climbed out onto the roof of the moving train, the cool evening air whipping around them as the countryside blurred past. The world beneath was a flash of fields, trees, and distant villages, but their focus was narrow. The path ahead, the danger closing in. Behind them, shouts grew louder. The German officers had spotted them and were now climbing up to the roof in pursuit. Lowell's breath came in short gasps as he scrambled forward, gripping the edges of the metal roof. Careful not to slip, Elodie was just ahead, agile and determined. They leapt from car to car, moving as fast as the train allowed. Each jump was a risk. One misstep could send them tumbling into the dark landscape. The chase was relentless, a dangerous game of cat and mouse played at full speed under the fading light. As they reached the last few cars, Elodie glanced back. The officers were gaining ground. With a final burst of energy, they slipped off the roof onto a narrow embankment beside the tracks and disappeared into the shadows. Safe, for the moment. But Lowell's mind was heavy. The loss of Marie in the ambush confirmed what he had feared. The enemy was always one step ahead. Someone within the Allied ranks must be feeding information to the Nazis. The stakes had risen sharply. Lowell looked at Elodie, who met his gaze with quiet resolve. They both knew that their fight was far from over, and now, more than ever, every secret, every move, and every whisper could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The codebreaker had crossed the line into the dangerous world of spies and betrayal, and there was no turning back. Geneva was quiet as Lowell arrived, the city's polished streets and orderly parks standing in stark contrast to the turmoil he carried inside. It was late spring of 1944. And while much of Europe was still caught in the relentless grip of war, Geneva remained a fragile island of neutrality, a place where spies, diplomats, and shadowy figures all walked side by side. Lowell's new identity, Ernst Baumann, fit right in with the crowd of businessmen and traders moving through the city's cafes and train stations. But Lowell himself couldn't shake the weight of what he carried, the secret codes, the knowledge of a traitor hidden deep within Allied ranks, and the danger that lurked behind every handshake. His instructions were clear. Meet a man named Major Hans Kessler, who was said to be a reliable OSS asset, working in Switzerland. This Kessler was supposed to help Lowell get the critical intelligence safely to Allied command. But something about the meeting didn't sit right with Lowell. Kessler was waiting in a dimly lit cafe near the train station. He was a tall man with sharply cut features and cold, calculating eyes that didn't quite reach his face. His uniform was impeccable, a carefully maintained appearance that gave off the aura of confidence and authority. As Lowell approached, Kessler greeted him with a firm handshake, his voice low but steady. "Mr. Baumann," he said, "I've been expecting you." The two sat in a secluded corner, the hum of conversation masking their quiet words. Kessler asked questions that seemed routine at first about Lowell's journey, the state of the code-breaking efforts. But then he mentioned something unusual, something Lowell had never shared with anyone outside London. A specific detail about the intercepted messages, a phrase only a few in the intelligence community knew. Lowell's heart skipped. This was no ordinary OSS contact. This was the Red Phantom, the traitor who had been feeding the Nazis information from within the Allied ranks. Lowell decided to test his suspicion with a coded phrase that only a genuine ally would know. He dropped the phrase casually into conversation, watching Kessler's reaction closely. The man's eyes flickered for a brief second, almost imperceptible. But that was enough. Kessler responded with a subtle nod and a slight smile, confirming Lowell's worst fears. The Red Phantom was sitting right across from him. Before Lowell could react, the cafe door opened abruptly. Swiss authorities entered, their expressions stern. Lowell was quietly detained on vague charges of suspicious activity. Kessler, however, moved quickly. With quiet words to the officers, his influence was clear. Lowell was not held long, just enough to unsettle him, to send a message that he was being watched and controlled. In the holding room, Lowell felt the walls closing in. The betrayal was deeper than he had imagined. Someone trusted had turned into a puppeteer, pulling strings from behind the scenes. Meanwhile, outside the city, Elodie was preparing to make her move. She had followed Lowell's trail, aware of the danger he faced, and determined to save him no matter the cost. Using forged papers and quick thinking, she approached the authorities with a new identity, that of a concerned Swiss citizen with ties to influential circles. Her calm composure and convincing story won over the guards, allowing her access to the detention area. Inside, she found Lowell tense but unharmed. Their eyes met, and for a moment the war, the danger, and the betrayals faded away. "Elodie," Lowell whispered, "you shouldn't have come." "I had to," she replied firmly. "We're not done yet. Not while that man is still out there." With a carefully planned distraction, Elodie helped Lowell slip past the guards. The pair moved quickly through back corridors and quiet alleys until they were safely outside the immediate reach of Kessler's influence. Safe for now, but the threat of the Phantom hung heavy between them. Lowell's trust was shattered, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The mission was no longer just about intelligence. It was about survival, justice, and stopping the enemy hidden in plain sight. The true battle was just beginning. Lowell sat alone in a small rented room on the edge of Geneva, the fading light of the evening filtering softly through the cracked window pane. His mind was racing, turning over every detail of the code he carried, the messages he had painstakingly deciphered over the past weeks. What had seemed like fragments of orders and coordinates suddenly revealed a far darker truth. This wasn't just intelligence about enemy movements. The code contained something far more dangerous, an override sequence for Allied defense systems. The realization hit Lowell like a cold wave. If that sequence fell into the wrong hands, it could be used to redirect entire Allied forces into deadly traps. Entire battalions could be sent marching toward ambushes, convoys rerouted into minefields, and supply lines severed right when the invasion was about to begin. He pulled out the small notebook where he had carefully transcribed the code. The numbers and letters blurred slightly as exhaustion crept in, but the meaning was clear. This was no ordinary message. It was a master key, one that could control the fate of thousands. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Lowell's shoulders. If the Red Phantom's network succeeded, the entire D-Day operation could be compromised. The lives of so many, his brother's friends, the soldiers he had never met but felt connected to, depended on what he did next. He had no radio. The sabotage of the encryption system back in England had cut him off completely. No quick messages, no emergency alerts. The only option was to physically deliver the code to Allied command. His mind raced with possibilities. Burning the notebook would destroy the information, but it would also mean losing the chance to warn his commanders and prevent disaster. Without the code, they wouldn't know the extent of the threat, or be able to counter it. The other option was to risk the journey south, to Naples, where the Fifth Army headquarters had a secure OSS relay station. From there, the information could be sent directly to Washington, and preparations could be made to stop the Phantom's plan. But Naples was deep into enemy-controlled territory. The roads were dangerous, the patrols constant, and every step carried the risk of discovery. It was a journey into the heart of danger. Lowell glanced at the map spread across the table, tracing the route with his finger. It was long across the French countryside, through the Alps, and down into Italy. He would have to travel mostly by foot and train, relying on resistance networks and underground contacts to avoid German patrols. The choice was clear, but the cost was high. He folded the notebook carefully and tucked it inside his coat. There was no turning back. The room grew colder as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Lowell stood, a quiet determination settling over him. He wasn't just a codebreaker anymore. He was a messenger, a guardian of secrets that could save lives or doom them. Outside, the city's lights flickered on, but Lowell's thoughts were far away, focused on the long road ahead and the deadly game of cat and mouse waiting for him beyond Geneva. With a final look at the fading light, he stepped out into the night, ready to face whatever came next. The journey through the Alps was grueling. The cold wind bit at Lowell's face as he trudged alongside Elodie and their guide. a wiry man named Marcel, who had promised safe passage through the narrow mountain trails leading into Italy. Snow still clung stubbornly to the rocky slopes, and the path was treacherous. One misstep could send them tumbling into the ravine below. Lowell's breath came in steady puffs, his every sense alert to the danger that lurked behind the serene white landscape. Despite the natural beauty surrounding them, he couldn't shake the growing unease that had settled deep in his gut. Marcel seemed anxious too, glancing nervously over his shoulder more than once. Lowell tried to focus on the path, reminding himself that the resistance had trusted this man, or at least that was what they thought. One chilly evening, as they made camp under the sparse branches of a pine grove, Marcel's behavior grew even stranger. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice was clipped and distracted. Elodie noticed it first. "Something isn't right," she whispered to Lowell, as Marcel stepped away to light a small fire. Lowell nodded but said nothing. He had learned the hard way that trusting too easily could be deadly. The next morning, just as dawn broke, the trap was sprung. From the tree-line, figures emerged in dark uniforms, German soldiers, their rifles trained on the group. Marcel's face twisted briefly in shame or fear before he stepped aside without a word. Lowell's heart sank. The betrayal was real. They were quickly surrounded and taken into custody. The cold grip of the German military police was firm but not harsh. Lowell noticed the efficiency in their movements. This was not a random patrol, but a planned interception. The prisoners were transported down the mountain to a holding facility in Trento, a small town in northern Italy. The building was an old stone structure, damp and dimly lit, with thick, barred windows that offered no escape. Inside, Lowell kept his head low, his mind working through every detail of the situation. He knew the importance of staying calm and collected. Panic would only make things worse. Elodie sat beside him, her face pale but resolute. They exchanged a brief glance, a silent promise to keep fighting. After hours of waiting, the guards came for them. Lowell watched as Elodie was pulled away, separated from him and led down a narrow corridor. He swallowed hard, fear knotting in his chest. He had to find a way to protect her, to keep her safe from whatever interrogation they planned. Then an idea sparked. Lowell remembered the medical terms he had studied while learning German. Enough to confuse an untrained listener, he decided to pretend to fall ill, hoping it would buy him time and possibly move him away from the main cells. He clutched his stomach, groaning softly as a guard approached. "Was ist los?" the guard asked, his tone sharp but curious. Lowell moaned again, placing a hand on his forehead. "Schwindel, Übelkeit, Kopfschmerzen," he muttered. "Dizziness, nausea, headache." The guard frowned, unsure what to make of it. Lowell repeated the symptoms, adding a fake seizure-like tremor that he had carefully observed from previous guards' reactions. The guard stepped back, clearly unsettled. After a tense moment, he motioned for a medic, who arrived quickly. Lowell's act was convincing enough that the medics took him to a separate room for observation, giving him a brief reprieve from the constant watch of the guards. But his mind was racing. Elodie was alone, and he had no idea what questions they were asking her or what information she might be forced to reveal. Time was running out. Lowell knew he had to find a way to escape, not just for himself but to rescue Elodie before the Phantom's plans advanced even further. As he lay on the narrow cot pretending to be weak, his eyes fixed on the barred window, the mountains loomed outside, silent witnesses to the deadly game unfolding inside. The betrayal by Marcel had shaken their trust, but it had not broken their spirit. Lowell vowed that no matter the cost, they would find a way out, and expose the Red Phantom before it was too late. The sharp rumble of distant explosions shook the cold walls of the holding facility. An Allied bombing raid had begun, precise, thunderous and terrifying. The guards scrambled, alarms blaring and men shouting orders, but the chaos created an unexpected opening. Lowell had been watching closely, waiting for the right moment. Earlier, a local partisan named Marco Ferretti had slipped a small piece of metal, a makeshift lockpick, into his palm when no one was looking. Marco's dark eyes flickered with urgency and hope, the promise of escape hanging on a knife's edge. Now was the time. With the clatter of bombs exploding nearby, Lowell moved swiftly. The lock clicked quietly, and the heavy door swung open. The guards were distracted, rushing toward the windows, and no one noticed as Lowell slipped out into the dim corridor. He ran through the stone hallways, heart pounding, but his steps steady. Outside, the sky was alive with fiery bursts, and the deep roar of planes overhead. Smoke curled against the mountains, and distant shouts echoed through the streets. Marco was waiting at the edge of town, his face set with determination. "We don't have much time," Marco said, grabbing Lowell's arm. "The raid will force the Germans to pull back, but only for a moment. Follow me." They raced through narrow alleys, darting past overturned carts and shuttered windows. Lowell's mind flashed to Elodie. He had to find her. They arrived at a small monastery on the outskirts, a quiet place hidden among ancient trees. Marco explained that a group of nuns had taken and wounded resistance fighters, including Elodie. Inside, Lowell found her lying on a cot, pale but alive. Her face was marked by exhaustion, and a cloth wrapped around her arm showed signs of a wound, though it was carefully tended. "Elodie," Lowell whispered, bending down beside her. Relief and worry mixed in his chest. She opened her eyes, faint but steady. "I knew you'd come." Their reunion was brief. Danger still lingered like a shadow outside. "We have to move," Lowell said softly. "The Phantom's network won't wait for us to heal." Together with Marco and a small group of partisans, they planned their escape. The monastery was too close to German patrols. They needed to disappear quickly. Their chance came in the form of a German military vehicle, parked nearby. A sturdy staff car used for transport. Using keys Marco had managed to obtain, Lowell and Elodie slipped into the driver's seat and navigator's spot, the engine purring to life quietly. Disguised as German officers traveling on official business, they set off south, hearts pounding as the road stretched ahead. The mountain roads twisted and turned sharply, lined with thick forests and sheer cliffs. The group kept a low profile, but it wasn't long before German patrols appeared on the same winding path. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a horn and flashing headlights announced pursuit. Lowell gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the narrow road. The chase was on. The car sped through the twisting passes, tires gripping the wet asphalt, as Lowell swerved to avoid rocks and fallen branches. Elodie shouted directions from the passenger seat, her voice tense but clear. "We can't lose them on the next bend," she said, pointing toward a tight hairpin curve ahead. Lowell took the turn wide and fast, the car fishtailing but holding steady. Behind them, the patrol's vehicles struggled to keep up, their engines growling as they pressed forward. The chase raced through villages and across bridges, the shadows of the mountains growing longer as dusk approached. Every second felt like a heartbeat in a high-stakes game. Finally, near a small farmstead, Marco spotted a hidden trail leading into the woods. "There," he shouted. Lowell turned sharply, the car bumping onto the narrow dirt path. The pursuing vehicles skidded at the bend, losing precious seconds as they tried to follow. The forest swallowed the car, branches scraping the sides, the sound of pursuit fading behind them. Inside, Lowell glanced at Elodie, whose pale face was set with fierce determination. "We're not safe yet," she said quietly, "but we've bought ourselves time." Lowell nodded, knowing the road ahead was long and dangerous, but together they had escaped the worst and were ready to keep fighting. Outside, the mountains loomed silent and dark, witnesses to a daring escape that had only just begun. The sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged skyline of Naples as Lowell, Elodie and Marco approached the city limits. After days on the run through mountain trails and hidden back roads, the sight of Allied banners and military trucks offered a momentary breath of relief. But Lowell's mind was anything but calm. The code he carried wasn't just numbers and ciphered messages. It held the key to defending the entire Allied front in Western Europe. It had nearly fallen into the wrong hands once. He couldn't allow that to happen again. The trio arrived at the heavily guarded OSS headquarters tucked inside a former government building near the port. Uniformed staff moved briskly through the corridors, typewriters clattered behind closed doors, and telephones rang with urgency. The war never paused. Lowell presented his documents at the front desk. The officer on duty, a young man barely in his 20s, studied the credentials carefully before nodding. "You're expected upstairs. Colonel Sykes is waiting." Lowell paused for half a beat. He hadn't sent word ahead. How could anyone know he was coming? His eyes met Elodie's for a brief second. She felt it too. Something wasn't right. Still, they had no choice. Time was slipping away, and every second delayed the decryption of the code's final layer. If the wrong hands gained access, entire units could be misled, repositioned into traps laid by the Phantom. They followed the officer up the wide marble staircase. At the top, the doors to the command office stood open. Inside, Colonel Bertram Sykes stood tall behind a polished desk. He was a composed man with sharp eyes and neatly parted silver hair, dressed in a crisp uniform that fit the seriousness of his role. Staff Sergeant Abrams, Sykes greeted. "We've been following your journey. Quite remarkable." He motioned to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please, sit." Lowell sat, carefully placing the sealed envelope on the edge of the desk. "This contains code intelligence extracted from intercepted Nazi transmissions. It's time-sensitive." Sykes nodded slowly, taking the envelope and inspecting the seal. "We'll process it immediately. You've done your country a great service." Elodie, standing behind Lowell, shifted slightly. She sensed something in Sykes's tone, polite, but too polished, rehearsed. Lowell remained composed, but his instincts sharpened. He remembered the warning from the British liaison in France: someone on the inside is leaking names. And now, here was a man who supposedly expected him, without receiving any communication. Sykes reached for a drawer. In that moment, Lowell made a calculated decision. He had memorized a hidden phrase, a failsafe buried within the code. Only the most trusted cryptanalysts knew it. It was designed to flush out anyone pretending to be part of the inner circle. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "Before you decrypt the document, you'll need to confirm clearance. Code phrase: April fades, yet the shadow sings." Sykes's hand froze. There was a subtle shift in his eyes, the briefest flicker of surprise. And then, too quickly, he recovered. But it was too late. The phrase meant nothing to him. Lowell stood. "You're not cleared." That phrase was known only to Washington's internal sus cryptographers. "You should have responded, 'Only when the dawn forgives.'" Sykes's smile dropped. He moved again toward the drawer. But this time, Lowell was faster. He reached behind and pulled a flare pistol from Marco's coat, aiming it squarely at the desk. Elodie, ever sharp, locked the door from the inside and pulled the curtain shut. Within seconds, 2 loyal OSS officers, alerted by the internal alarm Lowell triggered with the phrase, entered the room through the adjoining file room. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded. Lowell didn't blink. "Colonel Sykes has been compromised." He recognized neither the emergency phrase nor the counter-phrase. "I believe he's part of the Phantom's network." Sykes, calm but exposed, raised his hands. "You'll regret this. You have no proof." But one of the officers stepped forward. "Actually, sir, your recent communications were flagged last week. We just hadn't connected all the pieces until now." The room shifted. In a swift motion, Sykes was escorted out under guard. His silence said everything. Lowell let out a long breath. It was over. At least for Sykes. But not for the Phantom. Moments later, news arrived that a high-ranking diplomatic envoy had left Naples earlier that morning on a special clearance pass. The envoy was headed to neutral territory, and the credentials matched someone Sykes had vouched for. The Phantom had vanished once again, shielded by diplomatic immunity. Lowell stared out the window, watching the sun cast long shadows across the harbor. They had stopped a disaster. The override code was safe. Sykes's influence had been cut off. But somewhere out there the Phantom still moved freely, nameless, faceless, and dangerous. "We're not done," Elodie said softly beside him. Lowell nodded. "No, but we've just turned the tide." And with that the mission entered its next chapter. No longer about just breaking codes, but breaking the silence behind which the Phantom still hid. For days after Colonel Sykes was taken into custody in Naples, OSS analysts worked around the clock to trace every name, route, and signal connected to the Phantom's network. What emerged from the decrypted files and interrogation notes was the truth Lowell had suspected for weeks. The Phantom wasn't a ghost hiding behind layers of code. He had a name, a face, and a history. Major Hans Kessler, the very man Lowell had met in Geneva, disguised as an OSS asset, an ex-Wehrmacht officer who had allegedly defected in 1943. Claiming to bring with him valuable intelligence about the crumbling Nazi chain of command. He had been embraced quietly, his file stamped with sensitive placement, and his past buried under the fog of war. But the defection had been a lie. Kessler hadn't abandoned the Reich, he had simply changed uniforms. As the truth unraveled, Allied intelligence learned that Kessler had infiltrated OSS circles with alarming precision. Under various aliases, he had passed along just enough authentic information to earn trust, all while feeding the Axis updates about Allied movements, encryption patterns, and personnel identities. Lowell's instincts in Geneva, sharpened by months of decoding messages, running for his life, and trusting no one, had exposed the rot at the center of an otherwise loyal web. Now the hunt began. From Lisbon to Vienna, from Zurich to Marseille, OSS agents and British operatives swept through neutral cities, safe houses and diplomatic channels. Every lead, every courier, every known associate of Kessler's was investigated. Posters with his falsified portrait circulated behind the scenes. Code names he had used, Ranhard Ambrose Felix, were listed in red-inked files marked urgent. But Kessler was clever. For weeks, he stayed just out of reach, switching appearances using forged Swiss credentials and bribing his way through neutral checkpoints. He left behind empty apartments, burned ledgers, and echoes of intercepted signals. The war might have been closing in on Germany, but for Kessler the mission remained active, destabilize the Allies, even in retreat. Then, in early September 1944, a signal was picked up by British monitoring stations just outside Florence, a coded message in Abwehr format, faint but unmistakable. It originated from Milan. Lowell was in Naples when the news came. He and Elodie had remained under protective detail while helping OS reprogram and rebuild compromised code protocols. Despite the ongoing danger, neither had chosen to return home. Lowell looked at the map spread across the operations table. He's trying to reconnect with Axis remnants. He's trying to reconnect with Axis remnants, he said, probably banking on a fallback plan through the Alps. Milan makes sense. An OSS field unit was dispatched immediately, working alongside the Italian resistance and British commandos. The operation was quiet, fast, and precise. Lowell wasn't in Milan when it happened, but he would hear the report later from an officer who had led the raid. Kessler had been using an abandoned consulate property, a former Axis coordination hub, now watched intermittently by locals. When the OSS team arrived, Kessler attempted to flee through the back alleys. A brief chase followed. According to the field report, he was armed and refused surrender. The agents had no choice but to neutralize the threat. It ended not with a final cipher or broadcast, but with silence. Major Hans Kessler, the Red Phantom, was no longer a shadow in the wires. He was gone. The fallout rippled across Allied command. Dozens of field protocols were rewritten. Vetting procedures were overhauled. Signal traffic security was tripled. But more importantly, the damage Kessler could have done was stopped before it reached its full potential. Had Lowell not intercepted that first vague reference to the Red Phantom, had he not trusted his instincts or survived the journey from France to Italy, Operation Overlord might have played out very differently. The code he protected, now fully decrypted, included override mechanisms that in the wrong hands could have rerouted reinforcements, disrupted supply drops, and confused command lines. Normandy, Anzio, Cassino, all could have become different chapters in history. Instead, thanks to one linguist from Maine with no spy training, but a relentless sense of duty, thousands of Allied lives were spared. As autumn settled over Europe, and the war's final act approached, Lowell stood with Elodie outside the monastery in southern Italy, where they had once hidden from the enemy. "I keep thinking it's over," he said quietly, "but something tells me it never really is." Elodie looked toward the horizon. "Maybe not, but now they know who he was, and they know who stopped him." Lowell said nothing. The silence was enough. Behind them, the monastery bell rang once, a sound that echoed across the valley like a reminder. Not all heroes wore medals. Some carried codes. The war ended not with a single triumph, but with a long exhale across nations. In early 1945, Staff Sergeant Lowell Abrams returned to the United States, quietly and without fanfare. The world he stepped back into had moved on quickly. Flags waved, parades lined the streets, and families reunited in relief. But for Lowell, the homecoming was quiet. There were no welcome speeches or public recognition. In fact, the first thing he received upon arriving at Fort Meade was a sealed folder with a single instruction stamped in red, classified. The mission he had lived through, the codes he carried across borders, the chase through Switzerland and the Alps, and the exposure of one of the most dangerous infiltrators in Allied ranks, would remain locked away from public record for decades. Only a handful of officials knew the full scope of what he had done, and all of them were bound by silence. For Lowell, the secrecy came with a strange kind of peace. He never sought attention. He'd always been more comfortable behind a typewriter than in a spotlight. He resumed his work quietly at a newly formed signals division, helping train the next generation of cryptographers and analysts. Most knew him only as a quiet, brilliant code specialist from Maine. Elodie, too, found her path forward. She arrived in New York in late 1946. Sponsored by an Allied Veterans Relief Group, she took a job translating historical archives at the New York Public Library, work that felt worlds away from the train rooftops and smuggled radio parts of her past. Within 2 years, she married a fellow resistance fighter who had settled in Brooklyn, and the two raised a family built not on shadows but on hard-won peace. Though their lives grew apart in distance, Lowell and Elodie stayed in touch, sometimes with letters, sometimes with rare but cherished meetings. They never spoke about Geneva, or Naples, or what they had lost along the way. Some memories, they both agreed, had already said enough. In 1958, Lowell received a nondescript invitation back to Fort Meade. The letter made no mention of what the meeting was for, only that it was in recognition of confidential service rendered. Inside a closed room with no reporters and no cameras, Lowell was presented with a plain bronze medallion and a handshake from the Deputy Director of Intelligence. It wasn't a promotion or a decoration he could wear, but it meant more. It meant someone hadn't forgotten. The room went quiet as an officer pulled away a small curtain to reveal a dark marble panel etched with names few would ever recognize. There, under the letter A, was his own. Abrams, Lowell J. Signal Intelligence Service Europe Division. He stared at the wall for a moment, then nodded. No words, just a small breath. Years passed and the world changed again. New wars, new threats, new names whispered in the halls of secrecy. Lowell eventually retired to a quiet home in coastal Maine, not far from where he had grown up. His days were filled with books, long walks, and the occasional visit from former colleagues who still remembered code by rhythm rather than meaning. When asked by a rare acquaintance if he had done anything in the war, Lowell always offered the same answer with a polite smile. Just read between the lines. He never spoke of what he'd done in occupied France, the betrayal in Geneva, or the code that nearly changed the fate of the invasion. And though he never claimed the title, those who served beside him in silence, in danger, and in shadows would have used one word: hero.